The hall smelled of wax and steel again, as it had in the old days when Robert was lean and full of bruises and laughter. The banners of a dozen great houses hung motionless in the weak breeze that wandered through the high windows. Gold and crimson, gray and white, black and gold. Lions and wolves and stags all looking down on a throne of swords that cut the light like knives. A murmur ran along the length of the gallery and died as the king's hammer struck the step. "Bring them," Robert said, and his voice carried with the weight of a man who knew he would be obeyed. Lord Eddard Stark stood a pace behind, the simple gray of Winterfell against the brocades. He looked like granite in a room made for guilt. Beside him, Varys moved his hands together with a soft whisper, "Rings and silks," a careful smile upon his mouth that never touched the eyes. Peter Baelish's neat beard traced a smile that did reach his eyes, though it was a different sort, sharp enough to shave with. Ser Barristan Selmy, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, straightened at the foot of the dais and flicked a glance down the line of white cloaks. Ser Boros Blunt had the pink-swollen look of a man who enjoyed his meals and despised his duty. Ser Meryn Trant's lids hung low and sleepy. Ser Preston Greenfield's jaw was clenched. Ser Aerys Oakheart's knuckles lightened on the hilt of his long sword. Ser Mandon Moore's face could have been carved from tallow. And Jaime Lannister, the gilded sword, stood with careless grace, the very image of ease, watching the king with eyes that could go hard as amber when the heat went out of them. The herald called. The great door opened, and the queen came forward like a blade hidden in velvet. Cersei wore green to set off her hair and the glint in her eyes. A train followed her. Tommen, round and blinking. Myrcella, pale and composed. Joffrey, chin high in a practiced sneer. The hound walked a step to Joffrey's side. The great burned face seamed and unreadable. Lannister guards in crimson cloaks pushed the curious back. Cersei stopped at the foot of the dais and looked up through her lashes. "Your Grace," she said, and the room seemed to move with her voice, the way wheat leans when the wind changes. "I confess myself curious to be summoned to open court without so much as a morning's notice. Is the boar in the Kingswood to answer for my husband's bruises?" Robert shifted, not smiling. He had left his crown on the iron behind him, preferring the old leather jack and a mantle of black and gold that left his arms free. He had shaved. He had not drunk, not since dawn, and his eyes were clearer than anyone liked who made their life in whispers. "My queen," he said, in a tone that made the words an assessment rather than a courtesy. "For 7 and 10 years, I have named you so." The hammerhead tapped once, an iron punctuation. "Step aside, boy." Joffrey's mouth opened. The hound's hand came up like a casual wall, pushing the prince 2 inches behind the toe of his boot. Joffrey's outrage flared and died against the scarred stare. Robert nodded to Ser Barristan. The old knight turned his head a fraction, and 2 gold cloaks, rarely allowed so near the throne, ushered forward a boy with black hair cropped too short and blue eyes that darted with the quickness of the street. His clothes were too new, his hands too large for them. "Gendry," Varys murmured, a trifle too loudly for chance. "A smith's apprentice from the Street of Steel. So industrious, so strong." His smile widened a breath. Another figure followed, swaddled and sleepy, a babe with a tuft of black on her head, clinging to her mother's breast. The woman's eyes were wide and white in her dark face. She curtsied and held her tongue. Eddard Stark laid a heavy book upon the step, leather gone gray with age, the brass corners worn. When he spoke, the sound was low iron. "The lineages and histories of the great houses of the 7 kingdoms, with descriptions of many high lords and noble ladies and their children," he said. "By Grand Maester Mal Eon. The hand of each is here recorded, back through 5 generations and more." Cersei's gaze flicked over the book, and then to Robert, and then to Jaime, and came back to rest upon the king, cool and shining. She did not look at the boy with the black hair. "Your Grace, if we must endure another of your amusements, might we at least send the children away?" Robert's knuckles tightened white on the haft of his hammer. "They are the matter." Jaime's lazy stance lost a shade of its softness. He set his feet and let his hand fall by his side. not so near his sword as to be a threat, and not far enough to promise obedience. "Your Grace," he said, the voice beautiful and empty. "This is a grave talk for babes. Grave talks are the only ones worth having," said Renly Baratheon from the small council's place. He had not bothered to hide the emerald rose at his collar, the badge given him by a boy who stood among the reachmen on the far left of the hall. Ser Loras Tyrell's eyes did not leave Jaime's hand. "Read," Robert said to Ned, and the hall settled into stillness. They all knew of Jon Arryn's old words, the ones that had become a riddle. The seed is strong. Most had heard them because Varys had a way of letting some secrets rise like bread. But the king had not spoken of it. He had hunted and he had drunk, and now he was done with one of those. Ned opened Mallion's book and read. Names, skin tones, eyes, hair. From Tully to Tyrell, Stark to Baratheon. It was dry like a prayer without a god. It ended where it must. Baratheon, black of hair, strong seed. He let the book close under his hand and turned to the boy with a nod. Gendry stood, clumsy with the strangeness of all those eyes. His features were not quite Robert's, but near enough to make the small folk mutter, and a few lords glance at one another with faces they meant to be blank. Robert had seen that look before at Har. Runhell, when men guessed at Rhaegar and Lyanna. Faces were poor cloaks. Ned's finger moved from the one to the other. "This child is yours," he said, not asking. Robert did not bother to nod. His gaze cut to the children by Cersei's side, to Joffrey's pale hair, to Myrcella's gilded curls, to Tommen's soft, fair head. He let the silence test the stones. "It proves nothing," Cersei said when she had to. She did not flinch. She did not look away from the hammer. "Baratheons wed Targaryens once. There is dragon in your line. Not enough to bleach a dynasty," Baelish drawled. "The seed is strong, your grace, unless someone took pains to mix another." His eyes slid toward Jaime and flitted away again with an apology so quick it might have been a wink. Jaime's mouth crooked at the corner. "Little birds and big lies," he said. "I confess, I prefer the songs with a better melody." Varys spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness that lacked nothing in convenience. "I have a poor voice," he said. "But even so I hear well. The city hums. The septa at Stokeworth hums too, when she is pleased." "Enough," Robert's words snapped. He took one step down from the dais, then another, until the iron of the throne was at his back and the light reached him like a blade. "Cersei of House Lannister," he said, in a tone that made her face go taut. "I married you to forge a peace and keep a realm. We have had neither. I could wear your father's gold rings as chains, if I were fool enough to put them on. I am not." He lifted the hammer. "Where is the High Septon?" The High Septon had been drawn with some reluctance from his meals to witness a king's mood. He was an old man with a face like melted wax, hands soft as milk, and eyes that knew the cost of every indulgence. He stepped forward now with a little cough. "Your Grace," he said, "the faith serves at the pleasure of the crown." "Then serve," Robert roared. "I accuse this woman of adultery with her brother, treason against the crown, and the foulest deception. The marriage is done. By my word and by the faiths." Pycelle found his tongue. "Your Grace, a marriage once consummated may only be unjoined by the most stringent rules. The faith requires proof, and the council would advise caution." "The realm." "Proof," Robert thundered. He flung his arm at Gendry and the child at the mother's breast. "Proof enough to fill your belly, old man. Proof enough to drown a maester. Look at them. Look at me. Look at this woman's get." He took a breath, and the next words came not in thunder but in steel. "You have no king's blood in you, boy," he said to Joffrey, and the prince's face went the color of old cheese. "Stand from my sight." Joffrey's hand went toward the hilt of the sword at his hip almost without his own permission. The hound's hand fell over it like a shutter. "Don't," he said softly, and the sound of it turned more heads than any shout. Cersei's smile had for a moment turned thin enough to see the edge beneath. Now she let it widen with that old composed arrogance that had never once been mocked without cost. "You will not dare," she said. "Not here. Not to me." Robert looked at her as he might regard a boar he had already put the spear through, watching to see if the charge would come. "Ser Barristan," he said. "Take Ser Jaime's sword." Jaime's own smile answered Cersei's. It was beautiful. He stepped forward, hands open. "Your Grace," he began, and then his hand flashed down and his blade sang like a struck bell. He would have been the quickest man in the hall, if not for age and habit on one side and a lifetime's reflex on the other. Barristan's arm moved and the white steel met the Lannister gold with a shriek. The old knight took the blow on the strong of the blade and turned it aside with a turn of the wrist that made it look like a courtesy. Jaime glided to the left, finding angles where none existed, and more came through like a ghost to cut him off, and Loras Tyrell had taken a stride and stopped, breathing shallowly, hands empty. The hound did not move at all because staying very still in the wrong place is sometimes the safest thing a man can do. "Enough," Barristan said, and his sword did not tremble. "Sir, by your oath." Jaime's eyes met his. Old music ran in both gazes, a song from the trident. Jaime's blade sagged, then lifted again, and then he laughed. The sound was like glass breaking. He let the sword fall, point first. It bit a half-inch into the wood of the floor and quivered. He set his boot behind it and nudged the hilts toward Barristan with an elegance that implied contempt where words could not. Cersei's gaze went thin and sharp, all its green swallowed by the black of the pupil. "You will need more than a boy with a hammer to strike down my father," she said, very soft, very clear. Robert's eyes did not leave hers. "We'll see," he said, and there was something almost like joy in his voice, covered quickly. "High Septon, speak your judgment." The old man swallowed. He had known Targaryens with hotter tempers, and he had outlived more uprisings than he had digits to count. He also knew what side the small folk would take if given something simple to chant. "It is grievous," he said, "but grievous sins demand grievous remedy. The faith considers incest abomination." He folded his hands. "By the authority of the Seven, before gods and men, I declare the union of King Robert Baratheon and Cersei of House Lannister void and of no effect, for the wife hath committed adultery. Let it be proclaimed." The hall shifted. The air changed temperature, though no one could have said how. It was as if a long-held breath had gone out of the place. Murmurs rose, ebbed. Then a ragged cheer, uncertain, took shape. The face of the Queen of Seven Kingdoms altered as a mask might when its holding straps snap. It did not fall, not yet. She left it on a while longer out of pride. "Take her," Robert said. "Gently," I said. He looked down at Joffrey and hesitated, and all the hall saw it. When he spoke again, it was with his jaw set. "The prince and princesses are to be kept safe and well. They shall not leave their chambers without my word. One wrong hair upon their heads, and the man accountable loses his own." Cersei lunged, at Sandor Clegane, not at the king. She tore Joffrey's arm free and thrust the boy behind her with a motion more maternal than she would have liked to show. It made her human. It did not make her safe. Mandon Moore and Aerys Oakhart closed in, measuring distance with their eyes. Tommen began to cry, high and thin. Myrcella gathered him into her arms and whispered into his hair without weeping herself. The Stark girls might have done the same. Robert felt a memory scrape at him with iron claws and shoved it down savagely. "Your Grace," Ned said quietly. Robert had to wrench his gaze away. He was the king. It was a thing he had said and forgotten so many times that the words had grown moth-eaten. They were new now and heavy. "Proclaim it," he said. "Send men to Storm's End and Dragonstone. Send riders to Casterly Rock. Let Tywin hear the news from a dozen mouths at once." "I'll send a few ears while we're at it," Littlefinger murmured, and earned himself Varys's soft laughter beside him. "And one thing more," Robert said, and the quiet in the hall went deeper. "I choose a new queen." He looked straight at Renly, to nail him in place, and then passed him to the boy who couldn't help himself from shining. "The realm needs sons. The realm needs peace. It needs bread and barley and songs that don't curdle in the throat. The Reach has always been fat on such, and gold buys only the one thing well. Renly's smile was the sudden hilt of a knife. Highgarden has daughters, he said sweetly. The flower of them all, Robert answered, and the sound that went through the hall now was not a murmur but a held note. Margaery of House Tyrell, send to her lord father. Tell him I will come to Highgarden and take my wife from his own hands if he will give her, and bring the summer back to King's Landing. Varys made a little sound of admiration. Littlefinger's eyes took on that distracted shine men have when they are doing sums. Ned Stark closed Mallion's book like a lid on a coffin and stood very straight, the set of his mouth grave. He did not disapprove, he did not approve. He counted costs. Cersei laughed. It was not the laugh she had used when mocking. It was old and ugly, and it showed her throat too white. Bread and barley, she said. And when your belly is full, what then, Robert? Whose face will you smash first? Will you smash mine? Will you smash my father's? He will not bend his neck for you. He will cut it. Robert's answering grin was a flash of iron that belonged in another century. I am done drinking, he said, and though no one in the room believed him, some shivered to hear it. I am done laughing. I will smash whatever stands. They took her then. Jaime did not move. The sword on the floor hummed a little in a draught from a window no one had noticed until now. Joffrey hissed like a youth striking at a dog that had never learned fear. The hound merely watched. When it was over, Robert sat upon iron and let the old cuts in his back complain. They had made him bleed when he first took it. They had thought it a merry jest. See the new king wince at the throne that bites. They had not known the chair would go on biting for 17 years. The small council gathered at his word like crows at a plow. Pycelle wheezed. Varys flowed. Littlefinger smiled. Renly shone. Ned Stark stood. We move quickly, Ned said. Tywin moves quicker when slighted. The Riverlands will bear the first brunt. Hoster Tully will call his banners. The crown must stand with them. Robert rubbed his jaw, already feeling the old itch for motion. I will go west, he said, tasting the road as if it were a stave of ale. I will go myself. His eyes sparked. Let me remind a few men what a hammer is for. Pycelle chewed on his beard. Your grace will consider the hazards. The city must be held. Then hold it, Robert said, not unkindly. Ned will rule in my stead. Renly to the Stormlands to call the banners. Stannis? Where is Stannis? Gone to Dragonstone, Varys murmured. He has a well-thumbed sense of danger. Send for him, Robert said. Law is his stew. He will want it seasoned to his taste. Tell him he is named Lord of Storm's End again with my blessing. Dragonstone is a sour prize. His mouth quirked. He has done enough brooding over it. Renly's expression flickered, and Loras's hand brushed his sleeve a hair and fell. Ned's face tightened a fraction, not at the gift, but because he knew what it meant. Robert offering balm he should have offered years ago. Men are as quick to remark on belated justice as they are to accept it. Littlefinger, Robert said. Money. Baelish's hands opened, and a little kingdom of rings glittered. We have it, he said, which meant they didn't, not truly, but that he knew who did. The Reach will pledge grain and coin if the Tyrells are bound to the crown by marriage. The Iron Bank always admires a vigorous king. Varys looked sidelong, amused. And a vigorous interest, he lilted. Let them have it, Robert said. I will pay them back with meat and plunder from the west. The Lannisters have had their fingers in my purse too long. Ned's gaze was steady. Margaery Tyrell is a girl, he said, and Robert heard in that single word the warning he had already given himself 100 times. Lyanna was a girl. He pushed the thought away again, and it returned, inexorable as tide. Lyanna was a girl. She is a woman of a house that feeds kings, Robert said, more gently than his mood should allow. I have decided, Ned. You needn't like it. Ned nodded, accepting the weight that meant. Then we must keep the city still. The children. They are to be kept well, Robert said harshly. "They are not to be harmed." He leaned forward. "They are blameless. Hear me, they are blameless." Varys's eyes shone as if something had touched his heart. He might even have meant it, for the length of that moment. "Your Grace," he breathed. "How wisely you speak." "Don't slither at me," Robert snapped. "You'll make me itch." He stood again. He had never liked chairs. "Summon Lord Tyrell. Send my letters. Barristan, keep the white swords white. Jaime is to be held but not mistreated." "I will see it done," Barristan said, the quiet dignity of the words making them as good as iron. "Good." Robert's mouth curled. "And someone find me a map of the Westerlands with roads fat enough to carry old bones and new anger." Cersei's chambers in Maegor's Holdfast smelled of roses cut from their thorns, because her women had been stupid enough to think that would comfort her. She had sent most of them away before the scent could choke her. She let one linger, for the sake of having someone to slam a cup against when the desire took her. Jaime sat on the bed, bound at the wrists, but not so tightly that the skin bruised. The courtesy was Barristan's, and Cersei hated him for it in a clean, uncomplicated way. A shame that the realm did not share her clarity. "You should have killed him," she said, watching the lamplight on the wine. "You should have tried. You could have cut his throat before anyone moved." And then, Jaime asked mildly, "What?" "We would have taken the boy and the girl and the boy," she said. "We would have held the Red Keep. Father would have been here by harvest." "Ah!" Jaime leaned back against the canopy post, the cords in his wrists creaking softly. "And the small folk would have cheered, and the dragons would have returned on a wave of grateful song." The smile he offered her was like a white flag, fluttering because a man's arm had grown tired, not because he had any hope of mercy. "Cersei, look at me. You married a warhammer. It pleases him to use it." She put the cup down without shattering it. "Counted as restraint. You enjoy this," she said. "Admit it. You enjoy the danger. The way you enjoyed being 14 and lying in the dark because Mother had gone to Casterly Rock and Father had not yet come to see you'd grown tall." Jaime tilted his head, amused in the eyes. "I am sure you have remembered that year exactly as it was." She turned away before he could see the heat in her face. The girl, Myrcella, had not wept. Cersei did not know whether to be proud of that or afraid. Joffrey had hissed and clawed. Tommen had cried. The men all told her they loved her courage until it inconvenienced them. "Father will cut him down," she said, "to fix the world. Father will come. He will come like a storm on the sea." "Father always comes," Jaime said quietly. "He rarely brings comfort." She looked at him then, long and searching, as if the bonds and the white tunic and the chains of loyalty could be unmade by the mere force of her gaze. "Would you have me beg him?" she demanded. "Did you ever think I would beg?" "I never wanted you to beg," Jaime said, a softness in the syllables that might have been cruelty merely turned inside out. "I wanted this never to happen." He meant the truth, nauseating as milk curdled in the heat. She hated him for that too. Highgarden rose from the mander like a thing grown rather than built, towers like flower stalks, its walls green with ivy and old tales. When Robert Baratheon rode through the apple groves toward its gates, the air softened him, and for a half-day he was 30 again, riding as if nothing bad could ever come so long as the next hill waited to be taken. Banners moved like summer birds against the sun. The roads were lined 6 deep with small folk, and their cheers followed him like a tide. He almost laughed, and he did not despise himself for wanting to. Lord Mace Tyrell met him in the great courtyard in cloth of gold that cost a man's farm. He was round and florid and wore his kindness like armor, which made him not undangerous. Behind him, 2 men flanked like straight saplings. Garland Tyrell, modest and handsome, one hand on the sword that could take a man apart and pile him neatly by his parts, and Loras, delicate and deadly, who looked at Robert as men look at a statue of a god they have seen crack. "Your Grace," Mace said, bowing so deeply it came near to insolence merely by its exuberance. "Highgarden is humbled." "Highgarden is fat," Robert said, but he smiled when he said it. and Mace laughed as if he enjoyed the jest rather than marking the insult. "I come for a queen." "And you shall have one," Mace said promptly, and there was a well-practiced gleam in his eye. "My daughter, the jewel of the Reach." Margaery Tyrell stood between two columns like a picture in an old book brought forward into breathing. She wore white and green, and a simple necklace of emeralds that made the eye walk gently along her throat. Her hair, brown as good earth, was braided at her nape. What Robert noticed first were her hands. Steady, still, ancient in their calm. He wondered whose hands they were, hers, or her mother's, or the Reach's, passed from woman to girl the way we pass down a prayer worn smooth by many lips. "Your Grace," she said, and there was a lilt to it that made one think of songs sung at harvest in sunlight. Nothing like the shrillness of court minstrels. "Highgarden is honored." Robert took in the line of her mouth and the way she held his gaze. He had met beauty before and was bored of it. He had met cunning and been bitten by it. This was something else, a sweetness as deliberate as a soldier's saluting blade. "Lady," he said, "I will be plain. I set my wife aside because her family would make me their puppet or my realm their purse. I come to you because you are the opposite of them. Because we feed people," she said with a hint of humor that took of the teeth out of his admission. "Because we sing. Because we plant and harvest and build brown ships for green rivers. Because you love your home," he said, thinking of the red keep with its sharp wind, and that smell of ash that never left the place even when the kitchens were filled with pastry. "And because I am tired, and I want a place in the world that is not made of knives." Margaery lowered her eyes, a ceremonial movement, and then raised them. "You will find no knives in my hands," she said gently, and the careful precision turned the words into a kind of oath. Loras stood behind her with his lips parted and a look that might have been pride or fear. Garland's gaze measured Robert as a man does a horse he might choose to ride into danger. Mace's mouth noted a variety of sums. "We'll have the High Septon's words," Robert said. "We'll have bread for every man who waited on the road. We'll have wine for every widow in this city, and coin for every orphan." "Done," Mace said, because that sort of generosity cost him less than a fool's boast and bought him more than a small war's worth of loyalty. Margaery's head tipped. "You will want the sept to smell of apple blossoms," she said, and Robert, who had never before cared what a sept smelled like, nodded as if he had held that desire at the back of his throat all his life. The Reach rose to song, and between the verses a raven snapped its wings over Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister took the letter in his pale hands and read it through without stirring a muscle. He did not read it again. The wax lay on the table, broken. The stag sigil was a graceless smear. Kevin waited, breathing shallowly. "Well?" he said at last, because he always waited until the precise moment when Tywin wanted him to speak. "Robert never liked gold," Tywin said. The words might have been a lament, had he believed in lamentation. "He prefers meat. He will come to eat." Kevin nodded. "We are ready." "Not yet." Tywin set the letter down, a neat rectangle among rectangles. Cersei overreached. Jaime overreached. He did not let the faintest sigh escape him. "I shall not." He walked to the map that sprawled like a gutted animal across half the table. Small wooden men stood for large living ones. He moved a block that suggested Ser Adam Marbrand toward the Gold Road. He looked to where Ser Gregor might be persuaded to bring terrible order to the Red Fork. Ser Stafford had a way with men from behind, if not before. The West hummed with threats and possibilities. "Make it the Riverlands," Tywin said. "Make it Hoster Tully's belly that bleeds. That old trout has always fancied himself more lord than the river runs." He placed a finger at the crossing of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone, tapping once. "Ravens fly to Ser Jaime's jailers. He is to be treated as a prince. He must live." Kevin inclined his head. "And the children?" Tywin's eyes did not change. "They are hostages now," he said. "They have outlived their use as children do when men play." He lifted a brow. "But they have the use I give them. We will make the realm fear the thought of their harm more than it fears our swords." Men of honor are easiest to rule. And Tyrion? Lost to the Vale and to his own fondness for being clever in public, Tywin said, distaste curling his lip as it always did when his youngest's name entered the air. Let him rot there a while. There may yet be use in him if he keeps his head and does not bait Stark women into acts of courage. He paused, and for the space of 3 heartbeats, he allowed himself to feel something parallel to wrath. He had given his daughter a crown, and she had chased a mirror. He had placed a sword in his son's hand, and the boy had tried to be quick. He would have to be slower for them both. He touched the spot on the map where King's Landing would be if King's Landing mattered. Right to Walder Frey, Tywin said. He enjoys being courted. He enjoys even more the sound of another man needing him. Let us need him. Offer a marriage. He has daughters like a hive has bees. Kevin's lips pressed together in approval. And the North. The North will stay where it belongs until someone kicks it, Tywin said. Eddard Stark has his honor to tend. He won't risk it on an adventure while his king rides west wearing happiness like a stolen pelt. No, we bleed the Riverlands, and we call Robert to save them, and then we make a road of gold under his heels and pull it from beneath him at the last. Kevin looked down at the map. Then we begin. Tywin Lannister did not smile. He merely let gravity do its work upon his face. We begin, he said. Ned Stark had always hated King's Landing. The city had too many edges and not enough snow. Now it had a scent he could not scrub from his mind, though he scrubbed his hands every night. Roses and fear. He rose before dawn, when the gulls made their complaints over the Blackwater and the sky turned bruise-purple over the bay. He walked the walls until the mist fled before him. The city watched him as a dog watches a man who has yet to kick it. Fear and hope in the same stare. The gold cloaks took their pay with stiff backs and jittering eyes. Janos Slynt bowed low and put his hand to his heart when they passed one another in the yard of the barracks. And Ned marked the act as a man marks a fox moving along a fence line. Littlefinger whispered advice that sounded like laughter. Varys arrived with a basket of fresh pears, and news shriveled by the time it reached anyone who might use it. He visited Joffrey. The boy stood at the window, face thin with pride, watching the training yard below where boys with wooden swords did as men told them. His mother sat very still, wearing the green gown she had worn at court, as if refusing to take it off could make the proclamation unspoken. She did not sneer at Ned, which surprised him. Perhaps all her sneers had gone to keep from shouting. He comes to see who he's stolen from, Joffrey said, not turning. I come to tell you that you will be safe, Ned said, and even as he said it, he heard Lyanna's voice as it had been. Promise me, Ned. He had kept the promise and made himself a liar 10,000 times to do it. Joffrey spun on his heel, emotion learned at someone's knee. Safe, he said, the word a slap. Safe as a kennel bitch. I will be king. You will be what you are, Cersei said, soft and inviting. And it took Ned a heartbeat to hear the needle behind the silk. What we are is not what is given to us, my sweet. It is what we take back. You will have tutors, Ned said, ignoring the mother to address the boy. You will learn arms and history and the law. You will honor your guards and your... He almost said captors, keepers. Joffrey smiled brilliantly. Even at 13, he had his mother's face. And when I am king? Ned did not say, you will never be king. He said, when you are a man, you will be a good one if you are wise. Joffrey laughed. Outside the door, Sandor Clegane leaned against the wall and picked his nails with a knife. He'll try to have your head off one day, he remarked, calm as saying the weather would change. If you don't die in your bed of boredom first. I have no taste for prophecy, Ned said. Then you won't like this one, the hound replied. But he sheathed the knife and did not look after Ned as he walked away. The royal progress from Highgarden to the capital was a river in flood. It carried farmers who had never seen a king. It carried singers who had new verses ready for the old tunes. It carried petitions stitched with flowers and curses carved on sticks. It carried a girl who smiled and put her hand upon a queen's duties as if they had been waiting for her fingers to show them how to be pretty. Margaery Tyrell rode in a palanquin only because her father insisted. When the road narrowed and the palanquin slowed, she stepped out and walked. When the dust rose, she smiled until the dust looked like part of the day's design. She watched Robert with a gaze that rarely left his face and even more rarely judged it. She noticed when he stopped drinking, and she noticed when he wanted to, and she set a cup of watered wine under his nose without comment, the way a mother sets a bowl in front of a child too tired to think of hunger. She noticed how his jaw tightened when laughter came at the wrong time. She did not force laughter upon him. Loras Tyrell rode out from the column and back again, restless as a hawk in cage. He spoke low with Renly when the chance offered, and sometimes when it did not. Renly looked at him as a young man looks at the one thing that makes his untested life feel like a story that could be told aloud. He wore the rose and he wore the stag. He did sums of his own kind that did not always tally with his uncles and fathers. At Bitterbridge, the whole host paused, and Margaery took Robert's hand and led him up the sept steps as if she were already his wife. The High Septon's voice ferried the words into the air and set them down like soft burdens. Margaery's eyes did not leave Robert's as the vows were spoken. When he tied the knot upon her wrist with a bit of white ribbon, his hands were steady. When she kissed his cheek, there was a cheer so sudden and sincere that Robert felt a hot prickle at the back of his nose like the onset of a fever. He spoke to no one of that. He spoke instead at night to the ghosts he had carried so long they no longer knew where they ended and he began. "I will give you sons," she had said to him once, a lifetime ago, a girl in a blue dress that smelled of frost. "I will give you sons with eyes like winter." He had not gotten the sons. He had gotten the winter. He woke in the morning to apples and a woman with a braid like a flag of home. He ate, he rode. War unrolled in the riverlands like a scroll with blood for ink. Ser Gregor Clegane burned and rode and burned again, a black tower with a face like old leather. His men laughed as the grain crackled. The bells of quiet all sounded and kept sounding until the monks were deaf with their own prayers. Edmure Tully drew his sword at the ford and found his arm not as quick as his hope. Villages that had been words on a steward's lips became graves. Ravens beat their wings toward the capital. Ned Stark read the reports and traced routes on the map with a blunt finger. "We cannot wait," he said. "If the king is to ride west and meet Tywin, we must ensure the Gold Road is free of traps." He looked at Baelish, who showed 10 small teeth. "Money," Ned said again. Peter sighed as if the word itself bored him. "Coin, coin, coin," he crooned. "You Northerners have such a sturdy way of speaking about what other men call life's blood." He flexed his fingers. "What do you want?" "Grain," Ned said. "Passable roads. Wagons. Men to repair bridges. The city's own food must be safeguarded." "Done," Littlefinger said brightly. "We'll take a loan against the harvest that's currently being burned by Ser Gregor. The Iron Bank will love the poetry of it." Varys's voice glided in. "Shall the prince and princess be moved, Lord Stark? The Red Keep is sturdy, yet even stone can be made to weep if a man knows where to touch it." "They stay," Ned said. "The Red Keep is easier to guard than any secret we might hope to keep. Slint's men are to be rotated, and I want Stormlanders among them." "Stormlanders?" Varys lifted his brows. "Prickly men with a fondness for hot rain." "They are Robert's," Ned said. "I will not have Lannister gold found in any pockets within a mile of those children." Janos Slint bowed again, lower this time. Littlefinger's eyes flicked toward Varys, and the two shared a small piece of silence. "Ser Barristan," Ned continued, turning toward the White Knight, who looked as if the years sat upon him like someone else's cloak and might slip off at any step. "Jaime Lannister? In the White Sword Tower," Barristan said. "He does not complain. He eats well. He asks for a book now and again, and he reads it. He speaks rarely." "Good." Ned let out a breath. "Keep him safe. Send him a maester if he asks." He met Barristan's gaze. "Send him a swordmaster if he asks." Barristan's smile was as brief as a cloud-crossed sun. "He has asked. I assumed he would not be refused."
Ned nodded.
He did not like the man. He had watched those golden eyes at Harrenhal and on the Trident and seen too much that was hollow. But the realm could not afford Jaime Lannister's death in a jail. On the 4th day of the king's ride westward, in a stand of black pines that smelled like a northern spring, Robert's scouts brought word of a Lannister outrider company moving like a red thread through the countryside. Robert called the halt and held council under the trees, leaning his back against the rough bark as if it were a friend. "They run before Tywin's main force," Renly said, tapping the map. "Drive them off, and the small folk will think we have already won the war." Stannis, who had joined them at Bitterbridge with a face like iron patched over iron, said, "Drive them off, and they will simply run to Father and tell him where we are." He had taken the gift of Storm's End like a man told to swallow a knife and then walk to market without bleeding on his shoes. Robert grinned. He was thinner, or he felt thinner, and sometimes that was the same thing. "Then we will give them something poor to tell," he said. "We'll show them we're a day behind where we are. We'll cut 3 flags off and we'll send them the wrong way." The old soldier's humor woke in him. "And then we'll catch them by the neck when they turn." Stannis gave him a long look. "Your plans were always straightforward," he said, in a tone that might have tried for mockery and got tangled in thorny underbrush. Renly leaned toward Loras and murmured something that made the knight's mouth tilt. Garland studied the trees and their thickness with a swordsman's habit of measuring how many men could hide behind each. The Stormland's banners moved like a line of dark birds between the trunks. The Reachman's standards gleamed. It looked like summer and smelled like war. They caught the outriders near a low stone bridge green with moss. The fight was fast and dirty, a thing with teeth. Robert rode as if he had been bred in a stable for this purpose alone. He broke a man's shoulder with the hammerhead and felt the old thrill climb him like ivy. He lost 2 men. Loras's lance shattered, and he drew his sword and finished the work with a neatness that made Renly's eyes heat. Garland took a cut on the forearm and did not notice it for a quarter hour, and then he bound it without changing expression. When it was over, Robert stood on the moss stones and watched the bodies stir with the last silly movements of men who do not yet know they are dead. He looked up at the sky and felt nothing of the gods. He looked down at the water and saw in it a face he barely recognized, bearded, scarred, a little thinner than last year, not yet the young oak he had once been, but not entirely the fallen tree. "Your Grace," a voice said behind him, and he turned to find Gendry, of all people, leading a horse. The boy had found his way into the king's train as confidently as thieves find their way onto ships. Varys had arranged it with a flurry of hands and praises sung to the boy's strength. "What are you doing here?" Robert asked. He was not angry, merely curious, in the way a father dog watches the pup who has wandered farther than wise. "Shoeing," Gendry said simply. His hands were black with work. He did not look odd. It made Robert like him more. "A wheel cracked on the 3rd wagon. I fixed it." Robert laughed because the plainness of that was a bomb. "Fix this kingdom and I'll give you a castle," he said. And Gendry burst out laughing too and shook his head because that sounded like nonsense even to him. "Castles need shores," he said, as if teaching a lesson. "They still got horses." Margaery learned the city as you learn a lover, carefully testing, listening, anticipating. She visited the Street of Flour in the morning, when bakers cursed and sang to the rhythm of kneading. She went to the fish market and did not wrinkle her nose at the smell because the fishwives were as proud as any lord and had less patience. She sat in the sept with her hands folded and her eyes on the altar and felt the gaze of 1,000 women settle on her like a shawl. She sent for Septa Mordain and asked for the Stark girls to be presented to her daily, not to steal them but to show she understood what bonds looked like. Sansa curtsied each time with a face like carved sugar, sweet and fine. Arya tugged at her braid and glared and asked if the queen had ever held a sword. Margaery smiled at that and told her of a little practice she'd had with a foil once, laughed at by her brothers, and the way she had learned that knife and spoon can be weapons if a woman decides they should be. Arya's eyes glinted. Sansa's softened, which is a kind of warning in itself. She called for the alchemists and asked for lamps that would not explode. She called for the King's Landing singers and asked for new songs that did not mention dragons. And then she asked them to keep the old songs to sing in the back courts, because the older women liked them. She asked Varys very politely to tell her what the city spoke to itself in the night, and Varys very politely told her a fair fraction of it because he wanted to see what she would do. When the first loaves baked under her coin were delivered to the poorest alley in Flea Bottom, she stood there and watched in a plain cloak with her hood up as two lads began to fight over a crust, and an old woman smacked them both and cut it in half with her hand. Margaery did not weep. She went back to the Red Keep and told Littlefinger the distribution would need RDS, not to protect the loaves, but to protect the lads from one another, and the old woman from both. "Your Grace," Littlefinger purred, "if you continue to give so generously, you will put me out of my livelihood." "If you starve boys," Margaery said, "you will have to pay men to kill them later." She smiled. "I am saving your coin." Peter laughed and bowed and let his eyes glide down and up again, calculating, adjusting. In the Eyrie, Tyrion Lannister watched a bird fly against a blue sky so pure it hurt and considered how stories get told. He was alive because he had talked fast and walked faster on the sky bridge pressed up against a wall that had been stone before his great-grandfather was thought of. He was alive because Asel's word had the gift of timing. He was alive because Catelyn Stark had not yet learned the habit of falling in love with expediency the way men do. He received the news of his sister's annulment with a bark of laughter that tasted like vinegar. "Cersei misjudged him," he told Bronn. "She thought he was drunk to the marrow." "He was," Bronn said. "Maybe he drank the marrow out and likes the taste of what's left." Tyrion rolled a cup between his palms. "The Reach," he said, "always flowers with teeth on their stems." He turned his head. "If the king lives long enough to beget a boy on Margaery, Tywin's done." "Tywin's never done," Bronn said, honest. Tyrion nodded once, conceding the point and the larger one beneath it. "No, perhaps not." "What do you want to do?" Bronn asked, as if this were an alehouse proposition and not a question that might shift a realm's balance. "Live," Tyrion said dryly. "I find I have acquired a taste for it." On the Gold Road near the town of Sarsfield, the King's host and the West's army finally found one another with no more need for outriders or guesses. The day was bright and deceptive. The banners looked like a child's pageant. Robert rode along his line and saw his men, Stormlanders with axes, Reachmen with long spears and tidy armor, Crownland's men in mismatched kit, the few Northmen who had come south to be near their lord's king, stand with a quiet that you could throw coins into and hear where they landed. Across the field, the Lannister army glittered. It was as handsome a force as any lord might wish to own, thick with mail that had been wiped often, officers who had taught themselves to move like dancers. Robert saw the Marbrand flame. He saw Lyddon's badger. He saw Payne's ugly purple no, that had become an office since Ares. For a heartbeat, his mind drifted to Jaime's clean smile and the way a sword sounds when it thinks too well of itself. "Archers forward," he said, and the men moved. "Hold until the second horn. Garland, take the left with your pikes. Renly, keep the center tight. Stannis, if they swing the flank, you hold. Loras, I'll be where the line breaks," Loras said, too quickly. "You'll be where I put you?" Robert snapped, and the boy blushed as red as the field would if things went badly. The horns sounded once and twice, and the sunlight seemed to stand perfectly still while men decided whether to live with honor or die with it. Then the arrows lifted and it all became real. Later, Robert would remember that first collision as a sound rather than a sight. The huff of horses, the clasps of shields, the breath men make when they think they are about to be made saints. He saw Gregor Clegane, or a mountain large enough to pass for him, smashing his way through a knot of Crownland's men. He saw Garland's pikes come down with an elegance like writing. He saw Stannis hold the right with a sour lack of complaint even as his horse bled from a flank wound. He rode into the gap just as it opened, as if the field had always meant to give him that shape. The hammer fell and rose and fell. He felt something in him sing that hadn't since he stood amid the bodies on the trident. He took a blow on his breastplate and felt the world jump. Then he tried to laugh and found the sound lost in his teeth. There is a kind of watching you do in battle that is almost like not being there at all. Robert watched himself kill a man. He watched a boy fall at his horse's foot and had the presence of mind to angle his mount not to tread on the boy's chest. He watched Renly's line bow and then spring straight again when Loras took the place that had wavered without being told to. He watched Garland save a banner with a cut so clean it seemed to have been a trick of light. Then he saw, across the field, a banner fall and a lord go with it. He saw the mountain coming, and for a heartbeat the mountain was not Gregor but someone else. Rhaegar's armor bright as a star, his ruby-torqued gorget catching the sun. Old hatred and old need rose up and shot through him, as if his body had been a straw left in a stream. He kicked his horse forward. He raised the hammer. The mountain raised his sword, and the world went very small and very calm. They met like storms colliding. The hammer struck Gregor's shoulder and slid because the steel there was good, very good, and the man under it had flesh like old oak. Gregor's blade bit the horse's neck and bit no farther because something, Garland, Robert would learn later, had put a long spear into the mountain's thigh at that exact heartbeat. The horse screamed and fell and rolled, and Robert went with it and felt the ground search for his ribs with friendly malice. Something bright went down near his head, and he rolled again, and then the weight of the mountain fell where his chest had been, and he felt the mercy of the spear that had made the mountain stumble. He came up on one knee and swung the hammer at the knee that showed, and something gave with a noise that belonged in kitchens, not battlefields. Gregor bellowed. Robert stood. That was what living sometimes was. Standing between movements. An arrow hissed. It was a pretty thing, white-fletched, shaped by a man who had never pictured in the place it now occupied. Stuck in Gregor's neck where armor gaped as he swore. The mountain turned toward the new pane, and Robert brought the hammer down on the old one, and Gregor finally fell and made a different noise, one that men make when they come to know they are mortals again. "Leave him," Robert yelled, when 3 men turned to cut the mountain into manageable pieces. "He'll live. Let him tell stories with his food falling down his collar." The west broke at the center then. Not all at once, because nothing that is well made breaks that way, but with a steady melt. The Marbrand flame flickered. The Lidden Badger ran into a hole. Payne's men backed away with their commander's jaws clenched. The rout did not come because Tywin had not been fool enough to be present at a battle he could afford to lose. It came because Robert had come, and there was no one among the West's ranks who hated him enough to become his equal. When it was over, Robert stood on his feet with blood in his hair and mud on his mouth and tasted something like redemption and something like guilt. He looked down at the beast his horse had become. A quiet heap of bone and flesh that had carried him from one youth to another and been cut short because he had decided to love war again. He put his hand on the ruined neck as if that could mean anything to a dead thing. Garland came and stood beside him, breathing not at all as hard as his work should have required. "Your Grace," he said, "the field is ours." "Keep it," Robert said, weary laughter behind the words. "A man might put a house here if he could live without sleeping." News went out like water. Lannister men retreated toward Lannisport. Ser Adam Marbrand could not hold the Gold Road against a king who remembered he was one. Robert sent ravens with words like iron bars. "The crown is strong. The reach is faithful. The Stormlands will hammer until the shape pleases them." In King's Landing, bakers baked, and Margaery walked the Street of Sisters with her cloak open to the air. In Casterly Rock, Tywin read in a face that had more stone than flesh and moved a block of wood from one place to another. The first attempt came when the Queen went to the September. The knife was not clever. It tried to be clever by not being clever, by being big and obvious and accompanied by 2 others. Yet even so, Ser Aerys saw it before it saw him. They moved in on the left, where the light fell poorly from the windows. Aerys' sword came out with a breath-stealing sound, and Margaery stepped the one precise pace that meant a man's surprise put his blade anywhere but where he meant. The first cut took a hand. The second cut took a throat. The third man fled because he had never meant to do anything but make noise. Margaery did not scream. She reached for her septa with a steady hand and helped the woman to her feet, and only then did she let the shiver go through her body, as if she had been waiting for permission. "Your Grace," Aerys said, breath rough, "forgive the blood." Margaery touched his sleeve with a hand that did not tremble now. "You were sworn to bleed for me." she said calmly. You did well. She looked down at the man on the stones, at the red that had climbed his pale throat like ivy. Who paid him? Ares glanced at Varys, who had materialized out of a shadow's memory. Perhaps, the eunuch breathed. The better question is, who allowed him to think it could work? Both questions, Margaery said, in that cool tone that can make men feel they are about to be measured, are the same. They learned later that a certain wine merchant of the Street of Silk had been given coin by a man who had no lines on his palm to show labor, and that the wine merchant had been told that the Reach's women all bled green and did not know how to die. It was not a good plan. It was not a bad one. It was a seed tossed into soil to see if anything would sprout. Margaery had the wine merchant brought in and spoken to him very gently, and then she had his fingers broken with a mallet and sent him back to his shop with a purse and instructions. Sell your best to the poorest quarter for half what you sell to the nobles. When he broke the command, Ares Oakheart, who had learned the shape of this queen's justice, broke his other hand. Varys praised her mercy in terms that would serve as faint condemnation elsewhere. Littlefinger watched his profits rearrange themselves and smiled because he could skim this reshaping as easily as the old. Jaime Lannister read a book on heroes and turned a page with his bound hands. He had asked for it out of perversity and found himself reading it out of shame. Barristan came to him in the evenings and they played at words. Sometimes they fenced with wooden swords in a small private yard while Mandon Moore watched, his pale eyes steady. I have begun to respect you, Barristan said one dusk, as if reporting a symptom. That sounds like a disease, Jaime replied. He wiped sweat from his eyes with the heel of his palm and found the salt satisfying. Is there a salve? Time, Barristan said. And honesty. I am honest, Jaime said sharply. I have never lied to myself. Barristan raised a brow. Then you are better than most men. He looked toward the sunset over the river. I lied to myself for years. I told myself I served the right cause because I served what existed. Isn't that what service is? Jaime asked. He felt tired of the voice he used to hide himself from himself. Doing what's there to be done? Sometimes, Barristan said. Sometimes it is refusing. He struck, and the wooden blade kissed Jaime's ribs with a smart sting. Sometimes it is bending what's there until it becomes what should be. Jaime's laugh was bitter. Tell that to my father, he said. He bends what's there until it becomes him. Barristan said nothing. The second battle came near the borders of the west, when Tywin finally chose a field, and it went worse than the first because Tywin had chosen it and bowed his head to no one's whims, not even the gods. Robert lost 300 men before he understood what the terrain wished to tell him and pulled them back like a man who had just remembered a forgotten lesson. Stannis held the center and did not enjoy it. Renly nearly got himself killed doing something brave and unnecessary. Garland did something quiet and perfect with pikes and saved the right. Loras took 2 arrow wounds in his thigh and 1 in his pride. The king vowed aloud that he would not be baited into a third fight of Tywin's choosing. He swore privately to Margaery that he would return with the Lannister banners wound around his hammer like scarves. She stroked his hair and made a joke that was not quite a jest. Scarves look better on young men, your grace. He laughed. He slept. He woke to the sound of rain and the smell of horses. Tywin retreated just enough to make pursuit look foolish. The Riverlands limped, and Edmure held Riverrun with a ferocity that surprised men who had met his soft smile over cups hours before. The Freys made a show of deliberation, and Catelyn Stark rode to the twins and looked at old Walder with a face like a shut door and made him promise bread and salt as if the words themselves were a leash. He swore, loudly, with many witnesses, and kept his oath because he liked to surprise as often as he liked to betray. In King's Landing, Margaery gave bread and saw to the warehouses, and the Reachmen patrolled the streets with the gold cloaks, and men began to say, "Our queen," without being careful. Varys told her this with a little smile that showed the tips of his teeth. Littlefinger told her something else. That coin spent where it could be seen bought more safety than coin hoarded, and that generosity could be made to pay. She believed him to a point and made sure the points were hers. Cersei waited in her chamber like a lioness with a thorn in her paw, until she learned how no one ever proved that the alchemists had been stockpiling wildfire since Ares, that the great jars sat in dark places and sweated like nightmares. She laughed when she heard that. She laughed because she remembered whispers of burn them all. And she had hated the man who had spoken them, and she had been too young to know that sometimes the only difference between a madman and a queen is timing. She did not play with fire. She found men who would and told them stories in which they were heroes, and sent them into the dark with a single word in their heads. Later, and all of it, the battles and the loaves and the secrets and the vows, drew toward a hinge as heavy as a city gate. Whether a king who had been broken by love could hold fast to a new love long enough to outlast his enemies. Robert came back to the capital not with scarves but with a peace he had hammered out of 2 bad fights and 100 small victories. He rode through the gate and saw the garlands, and saw Margaery at the foot of the stairs with her hands folded and her smile precise, and he felt something within him that had been a knot begin to loosen. He slept like a man who had not slept since he was 18. He woke and sat beside Margaery in the hall and heard petitions. A group of smiths from the Street of Steel came with a boy at their elbow who would not stop staring at the king as if the king were a mirror. Robert laughed in the boy's face just to see him blush and then felt bad and gave him a coin to make the apology. The boy, Gendry, did not bow deeply enough. It annoyed a lord behind him, charmed the queen. That night, Robert stood on the balcony and looked out over the city that had cut him so many times and felt the old ghosts sidle up like wolves who remember your smell and are not entirely sure they won't bite you again. He put his hand on the stone and spoke very softly, so that only the rock and, perhaps, the gods could hear. "I will do better." He did not add, "this time." He did not need to. When Margaery stepped out beside him, she did not ask for his thoughts. She stood so that her shoulder touched his, and after a time, he spoke without prompting. "I had a girl once," he said. "I loved her because I did not know how to do anything else." He felt Margaery's stillness shift by a degree. "I have never forgiven the world for taking her. I forgave the men who did it because I killed them. I forgave myself because I drink well." He laughed with no joy. "I am trying another method." "Which?" Margaery asked. "Living," he said. "Ah," she said. "A risky one." He laughed then, aloud and without pain. The bed they made was not the bed of a man and girl. It was not the bed of a boy and a conquest. It was the bed of a king and a queen who had each brought to it a set of tools. When the moon waned, and 2 moons after that, and a third, and Margaery's body changed in its own easy way, the city's bells rang with an honesty they rarely managed. Men cheered because a baby means bread if the timing is right. Women cheered because a baby means something to hold even when the world goes bad. Robert stood beside Margaery and held his breath as if waiting for a blow, and when none came, he laughed like a man who had learned how to laugh again. Ned Stark stood to one side, watching, and thought of a child in a tower that never was, and a promise made on a bed that smelled of blood and winter roses. He closed his eyes, then opened them. He had a realm to hold. He had friends to protect. He had to go north someday. He did not know when. Tywin moved his blocks on the map. He did not waste himself on rage that his plans had not broken the king's spine. He knew patience as a weapon. He sat and wrote letters in a hand so neat it insulted the reader. He invited a Tully cousin to dinner. He paid for a fry carriage to lose a wheel at a precise turn so that a certain conversation could happen beside a stream where no one else heard. He made a practice reminding himself each morning that his name was Lannister and that he had never truly lost at anything that mattered. Cersei waited. She wrote letters that went to men whose names she did not say aloud. She taught Joffrey to aim with a crossbow and told him there is no such thing as mercy for a king, and he believed her because she was the only one who had never once told him he was small. Myrcella sat at her window and learned embroidery so fine that she pricked her fingers to blood and did not let her mother see. Tommen learned to love cats. Jaime read about men who had stood alone on bridges and did not jest when Barristan suggested that heroism is a kind of vanity. He agreed. He said he preferred vanity to cowardice. He knew it was a lie and Barristan knew he knew. They fenced. Margaery walked in her garden, and the old women came to her with stories. and the young ones came with hopes, and she listened to both with the same careful ear. She put her hand over her belly while it was yet flat, and then when it grew, and she said nothing out loud to the child except the names of streets and fruits and birds. She thought that perhaps if he learned the names of things he would love them, and loving things made it harder to burn them all. On a day when the air was like a bowl of cool water and the sea lay very still, 3 things happened that set the course of the next year. A raven from the wall arrived, black-feathered and irritated, and the letter it brought spoke of cold and dead and weakness, words men in the south always thought were metaphors until they weren't. A ship from Bravos docked at the river gate with an envoy who carried numbers in his head like a priest carries prayers, and in a small room above the street of Sisters, a jar that had sweated for 20 years cracked of its own accord, and let a smell into the world that made the rat in the corner die with a squeak too small for any human ear to pity. Robert sat with Ned and Margaery and the small council and listened to the old supply of words in new arrangements. The wall, money, fire, Tywin. The Night's Watch asks for men, Ned said. And grain. Give them grain, Robert said at once. Men are harder. The realm wants its strength at its own table. The realm does not know the knife at its back, Ned answered. Robert recognized the point because he had felt that knife and had pulled it out and made it into a hammer. He looked at the Bravosi and at Littlefinger and at Margaery, who watched money as she watched everything else, curiously, without shame. He looked at Varys, who fluttered a hand and named, carefully, the houses whose loyalties would turn if the wind shifted. We are not done with Tywin, Robert said. Nor he with us. No, Margaery said softly. But he is not a king. I am, Robert said. He put his hands on the table and felt the old throb that was not wine. We will build something. We will feed the city. We will pay the watch. We will make the West pay. We will not burn. Not yet. Not yet, Littlefinger echoed, smiling. When we do, Robert said, it will be because I have a mind to see the smoke, not because I am cornered. He met Margaery's gaze. And I would prefer not to be that sort of king. He turned to Ned. Send to Winterfell. I want men for the wall. Ned's mouth quirked. The closest his face came to pride that was not for children. Done, he said. He thought of the road north in his mind the way a man touches a scar in his sleep. In the night, Margaery woke to the peculiar silence that sometimes means danger. She listened. She heard, very faintly, the sound of men in the walls where no men should be. She touched Robert's shoulder. He woke all at once, as soldiers do, and was on his feet with his hand at the hammer before his sleep had left his eyes. Guards, Margaery said calmly. Not ours. They moved as if they had rehearsed it. Perhaps they had, each in their own different lives. The door to the royal bedchamber opened with a care that meant confidence. The first man stepped through. Robert's hammer fell. It hit wood because the man ducked, and the second man came behind him, and Aerys Oakheart was already there because the man had begun to love his queen's safety more than his own comfort. He cut one and engaged the other and would have been flanked except for Margaery, who had taken hold of a brass candle stand and swung it with both hands at the angle her brother Garland's lessons had taught her. Later, they counted 3 dead men and 1 captured and a smear of black upon the floor that suggested something more than men had been there. The stink of wildfire weak and weird. Varys fluttered. Littlefinger narrowed his eyes and made 3 quick new friends in the morning. Cersei did not order this. Tywin did not order this. That was worse. It meant the city had learned to act as if the Lannisters commanded without waiting for command. It meant there were too many men who thought the game had only one board and that it would always be theirs. Robert stood at the window with his hair damp with sweat and his eyes bright, and thought of his boy in Margaery's belly and of the ghosts of boys who had not lived to be named. He turned to Ned. We end this, he said. How? Ned asked, simply, as he always asked, as if the right question were a sword sharp enough to open a path through any tangle. We take Casterly Rock, Robert said. Silence fell as if the word itself weighed 100 stones and had been dropped. Littlefinger's eyes danced as if he had been told a joke only he understood. Varys's mouth made a small O and then smoothed itself. Margaery looked at Robert with something like alarm and something like admiration. "You have not the fleet," Stannis said, who had come to the capital for the birth and stayed for the danger. Stannis, who always came for things that tasted bad. "You have not the ladders. You have a memory and a hammer. I have the reach, Robert S." He placed his fist on the table. "I have the Stormlands. I have the Riverlands' gratitude. I have your stubbornness. I have Ned's honor, which frightens men more than fire does." He leaned forward. "And I have this, a daughter of Highgarden beside me and a son on the way. I do not plan to die of someone else's plan." Ned looked down at the map, at the line of cliffs that held the old lion's den. "It was never taken by storm," he said. "Then we will not take it by storm," Robert answered. "We will take it by hunger." Margaery tilted her head. "And by song," she said. Robert laughed, surprised, delighted. "And by song," he agreed, because he had learned the city and the realm at last. "Feed them, fight for them, make them sing, and they will call you king." He rode west again with Stannis glowering by his side and Renly bright as a candle, and the pikes of the Reach and the axes of the Stormlands made a forest behind him. They did not attack the rock. They closed the roads. They took Lannisport not by slaughter, but by patience and coin and the help of men who had always thought their lords loved them and were disappointed to discover how the love worked. Ships burned in the harbor with greasy smoke that made the gulls drop from the air. The fish stank for a fortnight. The city gagged. Tywin observed, eyes like knives under frost. He did not ride out. He did not sue for peace. He did not move his blocks the way fools do when they are excited. He tightened. He watched. He sent men into the king's camp to see if any green corners remained. Margaery sent letters into the west that did not mention victory and did not mention surrender. They mentioned children without bread. They mentioned mothers with dry breasts. They mentioned what winter looks like when it arrives too early. Some of those letters found their way to kitchens and from there to men's lips. A few found their way to Tywin's desk. He read them and allowed himself to be impressed that anyone had thought to write what mattered. The siege was not a siege. It was a reading of a ledger. Days became weeks. The men learned to wait without going wild. Robert learned to sleep without waking at every creak as if it were a man with a knife. He walked his camp with Gendry at his elbow talking nonsense about horseshoes and nails. He slept sometimes with Margaery's letter under his pillow. A silly thing, boyish, and it did not feel foolish to him. He sometimes dreamed of Lyanna and woke to the smell of apple blossoms from a sprig Margaery had sent tucked into the wax. In the 3rd month, a group of miners from the west came out of the hills and offered a bargain. They would show a way into a storehouse that fed the Rock's garrison, if their families were protected. "That is a trap," Stannis said, correct as ever. "Yes," Robert said, "and it is also an opportunity." He smiled at Ned. "I used to be better at telling which was which because I didn't care." Ned answered that with a small noise that might have been amusement. "We go with them," he said. "We send men we're willing to lose. We send Garland." Garland went because Garland was the kind of man you send into dark places with a light that somehow doesn't go out when it should. Loras begged to go and was refused. He pouted like the boy he still sometimes was. Renly kissed his cheek in a tent behind the line and told him he'd done well at not dying lately and should continue the practice. Loras laughed and cried. Not for fear but for frustration and something very like love. Garland went into the hill like bread into an oven and came out again with flour on his arms and victory in his pocket. It was not a great victory. It was a storehouse, the sort that holds grain for 2 months because a quartermaster is careful. But it was enough. The garrison ate gruel. The people inside the rock ate stories about loyalty and honor. Tywin watched and counted days on his fingers. Then, because the gods like to make men choose which fire to burn in, news came. The Ironborn had taken a fancy to the North's coasts while the Wolf's Eyes were south. Robb Stark, who had not yet been baptized in battle, now had his own war whether he wanted it or not. Ned looked at Robert and said nothing because he didn't need to. Robert looked at the west and the sea and his own heart and found that, for once, there were 2 right answers and one of them would break something. "Go," he told Ned. "I have men enough to wait. I have stubbornness and Stannis. Go protect your own." Keep the watch fed on your way." Ned nodded, the relief almost too heavy for his neck. "Keep the rock starved," he said, "and keep yourself alive." "I like being alive today," Robert said. "It's a new thing. I hope it lasts." They clasped arms. They had never said they loved one another. They had been young once and thought that love was for girls and for singing about. They parted now with the weight of grown men's affection heavy in their grips. Ned rode. The North's road welcomed him the way harsh things welcome men who know them. Snow fell. He smiled into it with cracked lips. At King's Landing, Margaery gave birth to a boy. He had black hair. He had a cry like a sword leaving a scabbard. The bells rang. The small folk shouted. Cersei sat in her chamber and threw a goblet through the window and did not watch it shatter, because she did not give windows that satisfaction. Joffrey stormed, and the hound laughed quietly. Tommen brought a kitten to his mother and told her its name was Sweetling. Myrcella stitched 3 blue ships on white and put the cloth away. Varys held the child in his thoughts like a candle in a dark hall, carefully, well aware of all the corridors the light might reveal if carried slowly enough. Littlefinger counted faster, not corridors but coins, and found that the new queen's generosity had made a river he could skim without making the banks flood. Stannis wrote a terse letter to the king congratulating him up on the only sort of legitimate heir worth the parchment. Renly sent a toy sword carved of applewood and scented with cinnamon. Robert returned to the capital to kiss his son's head and found that the boy smelled like milk and sleep and none of the blood he had used to buy him. He laughed and then wept, and Margaery did not remark either, because this was a man who had learned how to live and would need to relearn it every day. Tywin held the rock. He sent out a letter offering a truce. It had no apology in it. It had no admission. It had terms. It suggested that the realm would be well served by recognizing that lions and stags can share a field if there is enough meat. It did not mention the queen in her tower, nor the boy with the crossbow, nor the girl who had not cried. It did not mention wildfire. It did not mention winter. Robert read it and looked at Margaery and his son and at the map, and at his own hands. He had thought himself done with choices. He learned he was not. He sent back an answer as clean and plain as stew on a cold day. Lay down arms in the riverlands, pay reparations, send me your banner, and your grandson will keep his head and grow old and fat. Cersei will keep hers, too, if she stays quiet and keeps to her rooms. Jaime will be returned to the Rock when I have enough songs about this war to make it worth it. Tywin read that and did not change his face. In the dusk of that day, the jar on the Street of Sisters that had cracked let go a thin thread of green that caught a torch as it passed and made itself a tongue. It licked outward. The man who held the torch had time to think this is pretty before he and his torch and the world within 20 feet became a new light in King's Landing's memory. It did not spread. It was smothered. Men burned putting it out like men who do interesting things for kings. Margaery sat with the injured and put her hands to burns and spoke softly. She told the city about fire as if it were a god that required prayer and just the right kind of fear. Cersei learned of it and smiled into her cup and said nothing to anyone. She wondered if this was the way the world ends, not with her shouts, but with a quiet popping open of things other men had sealed. Jaime learned of it and thought, briefly, of a man he had killed in a different city who had liked fire too much. He went and sat in his cell and put his head against the cool stone and whispered a prayer he did not admit was one, to gods he did not claim. Ned rode through snow and found a boy with gray eyes waiting for him at the gates of Winterfell, taller than he had any right to be at his age, with a direwolf trotting at his heel. "Father," Robb said, and the word broke him open and put him right again. "The Iron Men," Robb said, and the name sounded like a bad song. "They have taken Torrhen's Square. The Manderleys are angry enough to eat someone. The Karstarks will fight if I ask them." "You must ask them," Ned said. "And you must ask yourself what kind of man you are when you've finished asking men to bleed." He clasped his son's shoulder. "We will get your sisters back," he said, because he had to, because promises are not always cages. "We will keep the wall fed." Robb nodded. He did not yet know what it costs to say such things into the winter air. He would learn. Robert sat in the Red Keep and looked at the city with a boy with black hair squirming in his arms. He named him Oris, because remembering old deeds can sometimes keep you from repeating old mistakes. He kissed Margaery and told her that the world did not deserve the hope in her. She told him it did, because she had decided it did and was not about to let reality spoil such a decision. The lions were not broken. They were caged. They were hungry. They dreamed of a day when the gate would swing wide again. Tywin Lannister taught his house to wait with a patience that seemed almost like surrender until the moment came when it did not. Cersei did not learn patience. She learned something else. The stag learned that to break a lion you need more than a hammer. You need bread. You need songs. You need winter at your back and spring at your side. He learned to hold a son without squeezing, to hold a wife without wounding, to hold a kingdom without thinking it his birthright. He did not get all of these right all the time. He got enough of them right enough of the time that men came to call it a good reign, one marked by battles that ended rather than began things, and by loaves that rose. Winter lowered itself over the land like a hand over a candle, lowering the flame without letting it die. In the far north, cold things stirred. In the riverlands, the blackfish smiled, and Edmure did not brag quite so loudly. And the people of a small hamlet rebuilt their bridge with planks bought by a queen they had never seen. In the west, men ate thinner soup and sharpened knives and told their children stories about a king who could be tricked if one was brave enough and smart enough not to get caught. In the capital, a boy with black hair reached for a woman's braid and laughed. The sound of it filled a room that had once echoed with shrieks and silk. Varys watched and thought about endings that are not endings. Littlefinger smiled and thought about rearrangements. Stannis frowned and thought about words written on paper with real authority attached. Renly laughed and thought about a youth that would last as long as someone else's time allowed. Margaery counted loaves and then stopped counting and walked out into the city without guards because sometimes trusting the world makes the world feel ashamed of disappointing you. Robert sat on the edge of the iron and did not bleed. He looked at the hall that smelled of wax and steel and now sometimes bread. He lifted his hammer only when he had to, and when he did, it fell true. He had once thought that happy men are dull. He learned that happy kings are dangerous. And beyond Elvis, in places where maps give up, cold eyes watched and waited, as patient as Tywin and as hungry as Cersei. But that is another fight, and another song, and another winter. For this one, in this breath, the lion's roar was not the only sound in the realm, and the stag's hoofbeats beat time, steady and sure, over roads that were being mended.